All right, we're back. Now, buckle up because we're going to run roughshod through this. All right, so there's a bunch of revolutions that I want to cover, and I'm going to cover them hell of a quick. And I might be hitting some information that's not on the slides because my goal is to give you like the full lecture experience, but condensed into some sort of super concentrated orange juice that you're going to have to water down later. So let's get this sucker citrusy, spicy, and sour. So the Decembrists, quick reminder. So Alexander the First beat my boy Napoleon, forever a poop loser. All right, but when his soldiers are in Paris, they fall in love with, they're intoxicated with French Revolution liberalism, the reforms of Napoleon, and they bring those ideas back with them across Europe to Russia. And so, even though a moment of conservative triumph, it was actually the sowing of the seeds of future liberalism and Enlightenment ideals. Crazy how that works. Check out my podcast, Egalitarian Disease, for more. All right, moving on. So here's the crisis that unfolds. Okay, Alexander the First, the holy anointed one, does not leave any male heirs, and so there's this crisis that evolves into like who will take over Russia. All right, Nicholas, his cousin, should be the clear heir to the throne, and Alexander names him. The downer is Constantine, who's his nephew, is much more popular and is liked by the soldiers because he does have a background in Enlightenment education and ideology. And so he's very popular with kind of the establishment. Nicholas is a cold, ruthless, reactionary conservative. And a lot of people are very nervous that he's like the wrong thing for Russia at this moment. So the moment comes for some of the palace guards and the king's royal bodyguard to pledge their allegiance to the new Tsar Nicholas, and they refuse. All right, so these are the Decembrists. All right, and so in this moment of refusal, right, they were trying to make it clear that they had desired Constantine and all of the liberal reforms that came with it. Nicholas's response was probably the right one, to be fair. He immediately called in the troops and shot the Decembrists to hell. Okay, and so it's a real grisly scene. And then there were some little flare-ups throughout the empire. But ultimately, really, the reason why the Decembrist revolt, although a horrible failure, was so significant is it was like the first, right? It's the tip of the iceberg. It's the first moment where we see it, and it is not going to stop, right? So really, the next 100 years in Russian history is just fraught with revolution and anarchists and assassination attempts and successful ones. I mean, like it just gets horrid, and this is the beginning. And not only is it the beginning, it's kind of like the venerated martyrdom. I'm in the light to my room. Right. It's that Jean-Paul Marat kind of martyrdom that all the other radicals needed to enshrine, to embolden the values that they were going to someday live up to. So, for example, Vladimir Lenin's older brother idolized the Decembrists. He became an anarchist and an assassin, and eventually he was captured and killed, and that inspired Vladimir Lenin to then become a hardcore radical and eventually a Soviet or a communist radical. So you can kind of see how there's like a flowchart of patriarchy of radicalism here. Okay, it also then convinces a lot of these reactionary conservatives in Russia and all across Europe that this was the right course of action. The Congress of Vienna said we can use violence to put this stuff down, and it works. And I will maintain my power by show of power. Okay, and so it continues on. And so here are kind of the battle cries of the Russian Empire. Now, Nicholas doesn't last forever. He will die, and then Alexander II comes into power. Now, Alexander II is a very famous guy. We'll talk maybe a little bit more about him later on in the year. But Alexander II, famous for a lot of reasons, but none probably more so than emancipation of the serfs, right? And so this is what I'm talking about Russian history, right? That pendulum swing. So Alexander I, conservative, and Nicholas, conservative. But then we swing back, and we got Alexander II, and he's going to be a great reformer until revolutionaries blow him to pieces. And then Alexander III becomes a cold reactionary. And then Nicholas, kind of by force, Nicholas II, has to become a reformer. And then the Great War, cucks everything, and then it falls apart pretty bad. Okay, and there's Russia. Now, let's move to France. Now, France, we could spend a very long time on. I'm going to try to give you the quickest version that we can so that we can keep keep rolling along here. So remember, 1815, my boy Napoleon is gone. And France returns to being a constitutional monarchy under the restoration of the House of Bourbon. Louis XVIII, this fine specimen, looking very much like his brother, takes over. Now, to be fair to Louis XVIII, he really understood the modern age, or at least the contemporary reality of where France was in the moment. And so he really left the Charter of 1814, this constitutional monarchy, as an enlightened liberal document with basic civil protections and rights. And he was understanding and kind of understanding where reality left him. And so he did not undo all of Napoleon's reforms. However, that really rubbed some royalists and conservatives the wrong way. Now, you got to remember, France was largely being watched by the Congress of Vienna, right? I mean, so you have people like not just Metternich, but you have Minister Talleyrand, for example, representing France, and it should have been pretty conservative order. Now, one guy who's very ultra, they call the ultra conservatives the ultra, is the future King Charles X, or the Count of Artois, right? He is also going to be the Dauphin, right? Or the next heir apparent. And so he has these dreams of kind of reinstating the good old days of absolute monarchy. And so we start to notice a seething undercurrent. And so there's a lot of debate. I'm not going to get into it, but there's some intrigue as to whether or not there was a falsified murder. It was an actual, case of family murder, and it was blamed on assassination. But there were some claims that a member of the royal family had been assassinated and that it was done by a bunch of liberals and leftists. There was no evidence to back that up. But Louis XVIII was forced to kind of get tough. And when he got tough, right, he kind of alienated himself from some of his liberal allies, and it forced a wedge or a divide. And in that exact same moment across the continent, it just coincided with a bunch of uprisings where conservatives were putting down liberalism, and it seemed to put France right in the midst of this struggle between liberal and conservative. So when Louis XVIII finally kicks the bucket, Charles X ascends the throne, and the pomp and royal circumstance is crazy. He had like a day-long coronation. He viewed himself as a divinely selected absolute monarch. And so imagine all of those things that would mean, right? A return to the repression of the old regime. Okay. Now, what happens though is that the people are not interested in reverting back. And France, because of the Charter of 1814, did have a parliamentary system in place, and there were elections that had to be held. So you had an absolute monarchist, in theory, trying to rule a country that had a representative government, in theory. And those two entities ran against each other until they had a massive collision. And so what happens is Charles, in order to prevent liberals from winning this election and establishing a majority that would challenge his authority, he dissolves Parliament. Now that sounds a lot like another Charles in history, Charles I of England, and that resulted in beheading. Sorry. All right. So he cracks down on the people, shuts down the press, tells the Parliament to go home, and like that, the French, they never even put the barricades away because it's France. They practice revolution on Sundays. And so, boom, call to revolution. And so the famous Delacroix painting, the French Revolution of 1830, there's our artist right there in the painting. And so off to revolution we go. And really the end of the Revolution of 1830 is a bit of a letdown. Right? So they replaced Charles with Louis Philippe. Right? Now, he is also a member of the royal family, but he fashions himself as the citizens' king, or what they called the bourgeois monarch, right? Because he lived this very middle-class, bourgeois, educated, enlightened kind of lifestyle. And so he was like dreadfully hipster and enlightened, real East Side kind of guy. And so he believed that he ruled with the will of the people, not with the will of God. And so that he was going to try to balance the aspirations of the people while still holding down legitimacy in government, satisfying the conservative order of the Congress of Vienna. Okay. Now, here's where it all kind of falls apart. So even though that should be true, ultimately he does a pretty terrible job. Right? And as the years kind of stack up, what we notice in France is um, an imbalance where we have massive unemployment. We got a lot of workers looking for jobs that can't really find it. Um, Unions and trade guilds had kind of like given people the chance to receive like artisanal education, professional vocational training, and that unemployment is now crippling the economy. They're looking to the government to like maybe step in and educate the people. And Louis Philippe really just kind of sits on his hands and like instead of picking up with some reforms, he applies more of like the hands-off laissez-faire, and it's the wrong moment to exercise that card. And so really what happens then, look at my floating head, is by the time we get to 1848, France is crippled by horrible harvests, food shortages, massive unemployment, and a government that doesn't seem to care. Now, little contextual awareness. 1848 is also famous for another reason. That is the year that the Communist Manifesto was publicly distributed throughout Europe and the world. Okay, so we're going to notice an increasingly communist, or at least an increasingly more radical feel to these revolutions. And so, like France does for any good party, they bust out the barricades. And so they put up the barricades, Paris goes into revolt, and within all of 2 days, Louis Philippe packs up his crap and gets out. The short-term plan was having a 10-man executive, almost like a double directory system, and they right away went full radical reforms. I mean, this was like crazy stuff. Full suffrage, ending of slavery across the whole French Empire, limiting industrial work days. I mean, this was like really going to go like pretty crazy until the middle class kind of pumps the brakes. So remember I mentioned before, you got the middle class, you've got the working class, and together they rise in this revolutionary manner, and that destroys the old regime. I mean, it took 2 days for the government to fall. But the problem is these two groups will not get along, right? The divide is there. The middle class fears radicalism too much. Now, the working class wanted the system of workshops. And what I mean by workshops is they wanted the government to create government-funded job training, like little mini unions paid for by the government. And so that was the main call. And people from the countryside are now flooding Paris to attend these workshops. Okay, a new round of elections are held, and what we notice is that it looks like socialists might be taking a greater portion of the seats in Paris's government. The middle class then freaks out, shuts down Paris's government, and suspends the vote in order to close the workshops in Paris. When this happens, the army is called in to control the rioting and looting, and it turns into absolute full-scale class warfare. It is the working class versus the middle class. It's exactly what Marx had predicted. But sadly, during these 3 bloody June days, right, you have tens of thousands of radicals that are killed because the military comes in and just offloads on the people in the streets. I mean, it's a grisly scene of government oppression. And it's really because of the failure of these two groups to work together. And so ultimately what happens is in the seething, kind of madness, the fallout of this failed revolution, the working class, the middle class don't trust each other at all. And then a name rises to the surface of Louis Napoleon, right? So this is the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. And because of his name, because of the kind of the fame of his family, he comes in and says, look, I can give Napoleonic kind of reforms. You can trust my family. You know that I'm good for business, but that I'm also good for the people. I will bridge the divide and I will heal this nation. And he wins quite overwhelmingly. Now, he's obviously got his supporters and his detractors in history, but Louis Napoleon goes on to be quite a famous statesman in European history. He'll be Louis Napoleon for a while, but then he'll be more famously known as Napoleon III of the French Empire. But we'll get to that later. Now, let's pick up the pace. We're going to kind of crack through this last bit. So in 1830, in 1848, we have a bunch of other revolutions that are taking place. And what's going on in Italy, for example, is more of a nationalist uprising. Now, we're going to focus on Italy much more later, but just so you understand, we have some secret societies, fraternal societies like the Young Italy movement, the Carbonari, which is literally the coal men or the coal boys, different workers groups that are advocating for an independent Italian state that is not Austrian. They want to be free of the conservative order of Austria. They want to unify as Italian workers, both in kind of a radical and in a nationalistic way, and they envision themselves being unified, and they're horribly crushed by the Congress of Vienna. All right, so here are some other examples. I'm going to skip Belgium. You can read through it later. It's not a big one that we need to talk about. Poland tries to have a nationalist rebellion or a revolution here. Again, it makes sense. The Grand Duchy of Warsaw had been one of Napoleon's great successes of liberalism in the East, right? They had copied and pasted the Napoleonic Code, and they plain old hate ethnic Russians. And so it was like a great bastion there. Eventually, after a year or two of trying to hold out, the Russians do eventually militarily crush bloody oppression of the Polish people. Okay. Greek independence, I'll spend a minute on. So down in the Greek or the Balkan states, the Ottoman Empire had dominated in that region for a good long time. But in Italy, you had a lot of exiled and expatriate Greeks that were hoping to see independence. And as the Ottoman Empire is kind of getting sick and dying, it's starting to, develop its own problems, a lack of modernity, no real great industry. Nationalism is starting to grip little parts of the empire. The Greeks desire freedom. And so a group called Heteria Feliki, or actually I believe it's pronounced Feliki Heteria, is basically a secret society for revolutionary nationalism. And so they advocate to unify all the Greeks in the world and resist the Ottomans. Now, it's a sketchy moment because it seems to maybe issue in warfare, and they're worried that this might, upset the balance of power in Europe. Right? The conservative order should not allow a nationalist rebellion, but they do. And the reason why they do is because the Ottomans are Muslims, and they view this as perhaps like a religious experience for Christian Western Europe. And so the powers of Europe do rally to the Greeks. Even some of the great poets, right, like Lord Byron, come down here. He ultimately dies in the War of Greek Independence fighting for the Greeks, and the Greeks will eventually win crushing victory over the Ottoman navy. Okay, Treaty of London gives them their freedom. Okay, so the last things to kind of like really remember before we wrap this thing up. These revolutions of 1848, and there's more, right? We could have looked at what happened in Austria to greater detail, but it's in the reading guide, and I don't want to bog down. But really, like, there's some kind of general trends that you want to remember. Most of these revolutions begin because the God factor, Mother Nature factor, right? There's famine, there's poor harvest, that's teamed up with like burning social problems, mainly unemployment. We see that kind of all across the continent, really in France, but in a lot of spots. So that's one. Two, we see that kind of festering desire for liberalism that hadn't really been allowed to fully, catch flame in some places, like in England with the Corn Laws, checking the growth of laissez-faire economics, with the Russians bringing home these ideas after the Napoleonic Wars, the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, right? Like those little infection points of the French Revolution had been burning, and now here they go. This unlasting alliance, and what I'm talking about there is like the idea that the middle class and the working class were allies. They needed each other. It was a symbiotic relationship, and they were so successful together. Monarchies fell in days or weeks to the power of the middle class and the working class. But then the middle class's fear and skepticism of its own working class and its own greed for political power broke those two groups. And once they turned on each other, no lasting reform would ever come in, and ultimately divided, they were conquered and they fell. Okay, and we do notice that there is usually a hint of nationalism. So in Prussia and the Frankfurt Assembly, they wanted German unification. In Austria, right, you have people looking to break away, Czechs looking to break away, Hungarians looking to break away, Italy wanting to unify. Right, and so there's a hint of nationalism to basically all of these different revolutions taking place as well. I hope that clarifies some of the points, or at least gives you an idea of some of the commonalities. All right, and then we're going to be moving on from here to a greater look at unification and nationalism.